Ever find yourself, just randomly thinking about the DMV? Like, what's the deal with that place?
Yeah, not exactly the most exciting topic at a dinner party, right?
Right. But trust me on this one, there's actually a surprising amount of intrigue hidden behind those doors. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the DMV, and it all starts with what else? Wikipedia.
Buckle up, because the world of driver's licenses and vehicle registration is a lot more complicated and, dare I say, interesting than it seems.
Oh, I believe it. And I have a feeling this isn't just about memorizing those traffic laws for the test.
You've got that right.
Uh,
First things first, we've got to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the acronym in the room.
hmm
DMV isn't as universal as we might think.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What do you mean? Isn't that what everyone calls it?
Well, yeah, it's kind of like saying cola when you mean soda or pop.
Mm.
We all get the gist, but the specifics matter.
So you're saying there are different names for the DMV in different places?
Bingo. Each state gets to put its own little spin on things. Some states, they'll tuck those DMV duties into a larger department, like transportation or maybe even justice. Others, they give it the spotlight and make it its own standalone entity.
Interesting. It's kind of like those choose-your-own-adventure books, but for bureaucracy.
I like that analogy.
Mm.
And, just like with those books, sometimes you end up with some wild variations. Washington State, for example, they decided to go with Department of Licensing. And get this, it's not just about driving.
No way. What else do they handle out there in
Oh,
Washington?
you name it. Driver's licenses, sure. But also boat registrations, fishing licenses. You'd be surprised what falls under their jurisdiction.
Talk about a one-stop shop.
Wow, that's way more efficient than our system. Makes you wonder how they managed to juggle all of that at the state level.
It's definitely a different approach. And speaking of different approaches, Hawaii throws us a real curveball. They basically said, you know what, local governments, you handle this whole DMV thing. Wait, seriously. So each island is basically doing its own thing. That's a whole other level of decentralized.
Right. Imagine being used to a nice, uniform DMV system, and then you move to Hawaii, and it's like the Wild West of driver's licenses. Really puts things in perspective.
It really does. It shows how differently we can approach these essential government functions. So we've talked names and structures, but I have a feeling the DMV's responsibilities go way beyond just licenses and those little registration stickers.
Oh, you have no idea. Get ready to have your mind blown, because this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about vehicle titles, making sure those odometer readings are legit so you don't get scammed buying a used car, and even enforcing certain laws. The DMV does it all.
Whoa, hold on. The DMV is involved in law enforcement. That's not what I was expecting.
It's true. They're like the unsung heroes of the open road, making sure
Mhm.
things run smoothly.
Okay, you've got to give me an example. What kind of law enforcement are we talking about here?
All right, picture this North Carolina. You're cruising down the highway, windows tinted so dark you could barely see the sun. Suddenly you get pulled over. But it's not the police, it's the DMV. Turns out, in North Carolina, DMV inspectors are sworn officers cracking down on illegal window tinting.
Seriously, I had no idea those inspections were so serious. It's like the DMV has a secret agent side hustle.
Right. They're not just pushing paperwork, they're out there upholding the law. And speaking of serious business, we've got to talk about driver's licenses and their role in, well, identification. In a country like the U.S. without a national ID card, that little plastic card from the DMV carries a lot of weight.
That's a really good point. Think about it. Airports, bars, sometimes even voting, you need to show your driver's license. It's like the default ID for so many things.
Exactly. And that puts the DMV in a pretty powerful position. They're not just issuing licenses, they're essentially verifying your identity for all sorts of situations. It's a pretty big responsibility when you think about it.
It really is. It's like they're the gatekeepers to so many aspects of our lives. And to think it all starts with that dreaded trip to the DMV.
And that power, it's not just about checking your paperwork. We're talking real consequences here. Like, imagine refusing a sobriety test, if you're pulled over. In some states, like California, that can mean you lose your license right then and there. No trial, no nothing.
Wow, that's intense. It's easy to forget that a driver's license, it's not just a piece of plastic. It's tied to our legal rights, our freedom of movement. Kind of makes you think, right?
Absolutely. It brings up all sorts of questions about due process, the balance of power, the whole shebang. But for now, let's maybe shift gears a bit. We've been talking about the U.S. system, but this whole driving thing, it's obviously not unique to us.
Right. What's the DMV situation like in other parts of the world? Are we the only ones dealing with long lines and confusing paperwork?
Well, according to our trusty Wikipedia source, it's a mixed bag out there. Canada, for example, they're pretty similar to us. Each province, kind of like our states, They handle their own driver's licenses and all that jazz.
So like a North American tradition of, what do they call it, decentralization?
Sounds about right. But then you've got places like Japan, where they keep it nice and centralized. One system for the whole country. It's fascinating to see how these different approaches play out.
Definitely. And it's not just about countries, right? We were talking about variations within the U.S. too.
Oh, yeah. Like we said, each state has its own little DMV quirks. We talked about Washington and their Department of Licensing. But did you know that in Kentucky and Tennessee, they hand off a lot of the actual registration stuff to the county clerks?
Interesting. So it's like the state sets the rules, but the counties are in charge of making it happen.
Exactly. It's this whole other level of delegation and, potential for variation.
Right. On one hand, you've got the potential for local communities to tailor things to their specific needs. But on the other hand, you could end up with a confusing patchwork of different procedures and interpretations of the rules. Talk about a headache for drivers.
For sure. It's that age-old debate.
Mm.
Centralize for consistency or decentralize and give more power to the locals. And the DMV, it's like a little microcosm of that whole dilemma.
Totally. It's bigger than just getting your license renewed. And speaking of different approaches, what about Washington, D.C.? They've got their own unique situation going on, right?
Absolutely. They keep it simple. No need for a separate DMV department or anything. They just fold it right into the city government structure.
Makes sense. With D.C. being its own unique entity and all that, it's like the DMV adapts to fit the circumstances. But here's a thought. What about people who are always on the move? Military families, college students living out of state, that kind of thing. Does the DMV make any exceptions for them?
That's a really good question. And the Wikipedia article actually addresses that. Turns out there are some cases where that whole your license, your state rule, it gets a little flexible. Active duty military, for instance, they get a bit of a pass.
Oh, that makes sense. It wouldn't be fair to make them constantly change their registration every time they get stationed somewhere new.
Exactly. Federal law recognizes that their relocations, they're often temporary. So they usually get to keep their home state license and registration. Or they can choose to get new ones at their duty station, whatever works best for them.
This seems reasonable. What about college students? Do they get any special treatment?
Some states, they do extend that same courtesy to out-of-state students,
Mm-hmm.
let them keep their existing licenses and registrations. It's all about recognizing those situations where someone's connection to a state, it's a little more, shall we say, fluid.
Yeah, life isn't always as simple as one driver, one address. But here's a curveball for you. What about the federal government? They must have a ton of vehicles. Do they go through the regular DMV system?
Oh, that's where things get even more interesting. The article, it actually dives into this. Apparently, the feds, they don't mess around with state DMVs. They've got their own system, run through the General Services Administration, or GSA for short.
The GSA, so like a DMV within the DMV. Do they have their own special license plates too?
You bet they do. You know those U.S. government plates you sometimes see? That's them.
That's so cool. So it's like a whole other layer of bureaucracy we never even knew existed. But what about the people actually driving those government vehicles? They still need regular driver's licenses, right?
Of course. Even if Uncle Sam is the one holding the registration, those drivers still need to be licensed up in their home state or territory. It's a
Yeah.
great example of how those federal and state responsibilities, they can get all intertwined.
It's like a big, complicated web, and the DMV is right there in the middle of it all. But let's maybe zoom back in for a second. We talked about the DMV's role in, issuing licenses and all that. But I'm curious about the whole driver certification process. What does that actually involve?
Oh, it's more than just those nerve-wracking driving tests we all know and love. In some states, the DMV, they actually have a say in how private driving schools operate.
Really? They have that much oversight?
They do. Think about it. They're the ones ultimately responsible for making sure people are getting proper driver's education right.
Oh,
And that has huge implications for safety on the roads.
that's true. It's like they set the standards for who gets to teach you how to drive. Talk about a big responsibility. And I'm guessing those driver's manuals, those big, boring books we all pretend to read, those are straight from the DMV, right?
You got it. Those manuals, they're like the DMV's way of saying, all right, here's everything you need to know to be a safe and responsible driver in our state. The rules of the road, literally, all laid out in black and white. Knowing that stuff, it's your ticket to getting behind the wheel. Legal.
Yeah, it's not just about cramming for the test. It's about actually understanding what it means to be out there on the road, sharing the space with other drivers and pedestrians. Big responsibility.
Absolutely. It's about making sure those drivers out there, they've got the knowledge and the skills to make smart decisions behind the wheel. But, it's not just about the drivers themselves. What about the cars? The DMV, they've got a big role to play when it comes to vehicle registration and all that fun stuff.
Right, because those cars, they need their own paperwork, too. It's like a whole other branch of the DMV universe.
Exactly. And it's more than just slapping on a license plate and calling it a day. Remember we were talking about odometer fraud earlier?
Oh, yeah, that's a scary thought, especially if you're buying used.
Well, the DMV, they're actually on the front lines of preventing that kind of thing.
Hmm.
They keep track of all those detailed vehicle records, including those odometer readings, to make sure everything's on the up and up.
So they're like the guardians of accurate car history? That's actually pretty reassuring.
They are. They make sure those records are accurate and accessible so that buyers aren't getting ripped off. And it goes beyond just registration, too. The DMV, they're the ones issuing those vehicle titles. Those official documents that prove you actually own the car.
Those things. They always seem super important, but I never really know what to do with them.
I hear you. Think of them like birth certificates for cars. They establish a legal record of ownership, which is crucial for buying, selling, inheriting, you name it. Prevents all sorts of disputes and headaches down the line.
Makes sense. So we've covered registration, titles, making sure those odometers aren't lying. What about the law enforcement side of things? We touched on that earlier, and I'm still kind of mind blown that the DMV is involved in that.
Right. It's like a whole other side to them. And it's not just about paperwork and processing. They actually have the authority to enforce motor vehicle laws.
Wait, seriously, there are DMV officers out there, like upholding the law.
Oh, yeah. Many DMVs, they've got sworn law enforcement officers on staff. They investigate stolen vehicles, fraudulent registrations, all sorts of things.
Wow, so those DMV inspectors, they're not just checking your headlights, they're like actual officers of the law.
That's right. They can investigate, issue citations, even work with the police on certain cases. It's all about keeping those roads safe and making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
It's like the DMV, they're like the unsung heroes of the road, working behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly. We always give them a hard time about the lines and the paperwork, but they're actually doing some really important work.
They really are. It's easy to forget that when you're stuck waiting for your number to be called. But the DMV, they play a vital role in our lives. From those driver's licenses that get us into bars, to making sure those used cars we buy are actually what they say they are. They're involved in so many aspects of our lives.
It's like a whole ecosystem we rarely think about. Next time I'm at the DMV, I'm going to be giving everyone there a mental high five.
Me too. It's a thankless job, but someone's got to do it.
That's right. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the surprisingly complex and, dare I say, fascinating world of the DMV.
Agreed. Who knew there was so much to learn about those guys?
Right. It just goes to show you never know what you'll uncover when you start digging a little deeper. Until next time, keep those engines running, those licenses valid, and those minds curious.